I always thought I had seen the worst of humanity in my line of work, people lying, stealing, hurting others without a second thought, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the sight of my own daughter crumpled on the ground, her head bleeding because a neighbor decided her rage was more important than a child's life. My daughter isn't just any child. She was born with challenges most adults couldn't survive, yet she faces every day with courage, carrying her books, smiling through therapy, learning in ways that humble me as her father. And on that afternoon, all she wanted to do was sit quietly with her laptop under the warm sun, enjoying a small piece of normal childhood. But HOA, Karen, our self appointed queen of the neighborhood, couldn't stand it. She stormed over, shouting nonsense about community rules, words that meant nothing in the face of a little girl's innocence. Then, in a flash of unthinkable cruelty, she snatched the laptop and smashed it into my daughter's head as if she were swatting at a fly. The sound, the scream, the sight of my little girl falling, it froze my blood. Neighbors gasped, some shouted, but nobody stepped forward. Nobody stopped her. For a heartbeat, it felt like the whole world turned its back on us, letting a child suffer at the hands of a bully drunk on power. My heart didn't just break, it ignited. Because what Karen didn't know, what nobody in that neighborhood yet understood, was that behind the quiet man rushing to his daughter's side stood someone far more dangerous than they ever imagined. And in that moment, I swore she would regret every ounce of pain she had just unleashed. It had begun as one of those deceptively peaceful mornings, the kind where the birds seemed to sing a little louder, where the air carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass, and where you almost believed the world was as kind as it pretended to be. My daughter had woken up excited, clutching her laptop to her chest as though it were her lifeline, which in many ways it was. That little device held her therapy apps, her journaling space, her school assignments, and even her escape, her stories and drawings that gave her strength when the world felt heavy. She had begged me to let her sit outside by the garden while she worked, and I agreed, happy that she wanted to breathe in the sunlight and hear the laughter of children playing down the street. From inside the kitchen, I could see her on the porch, legs curled up beneath her, humming quietly as her fingers tapped across the keyboard. It was the picture of innocence and resilience, wrapped up in the body of a girl who had already endured far more than her fair share. The neighborhood itself looked perfect that morning. Lawns trimmed with military precision, hedges sculpted like art pieces, and driveways lined with polished cars that gleamed under the sun. But beneath that postcard beauty, there was a darker undercurrent, a tension that I had long felt, but my daughter was too young to notice. It came from the woman everyone knew, but nobody really liked, the one who wore her arrogance like a crown and treated the HOA rulebook as her personal weapon. Karen. She was the type who thrived on control, the kind who thought her voice carried more weight than anyone else's, and the kind who would rather burn down peace than allow someone else to live freely. And, for reasons I could never fully explain, she had decided that my family, especially my daughter, was her personal target. It started small, the kind of petty cruelty most people dismiss as annoyance. A note taped to our door claiming our garden plants were non-compliant, a warning about leaving our trash bins at the curb for 2 hours too long, an email accusing us of violating noise standards when my daughter laughed too loud on a Saturday morning. None of it mattered in reality. None of it was even enforceable, but Karen thrived on the intimidation, on the idea that her words could make us shrink. Most days I bit my tongue. I had trained myself to stay calm, to blend in, to be the quiet neighbor who caused no ripples. After all, my work had taught me patience, taught me that silence was often more powerful than reaction. But silence came at a cost, and that cost was my daughter learning, little by little, that her joy seemed to offend someone powerful enough to make life uncomfortable. On that day, as she typed happily in the sunlight, I noticed Karen pacing on her lawn across the street, her sharp eyes darting toward us like arrows. She had that look, chin high, lips pursed, arms folded tight across her chest. I recognized it instantly because I had seen it in interrogation rooms and in hostile meetings abroad. The posture of someone who had already decided she was at war. My daughter, too lost in her world of typing and humming, didn't notice the storm brewing. But I did. And though I wanted to believe it was just another stare, just another silent battle in this strange suburban war, something in my chest told me this day was different. The truth about people like Karen is that they don't just stop. They escalate. They feed on control like it's oxygen, and when they feel powerless, they lash out harder, uglier, and more viciously. As I watched her muttering under her breath, pacing closer to our property line, I felt the first sharp pang of dread in my stomach. I had seen men prepare to do unspeakable things, and they always had that same restless energy, that same fire simmering in their eyes. The fact that it was now radiating from a woman armed with nothing more than a HOA rulebook made it no less dangerous. I stepped out onto the porch and asked my daughter if she wanted lemonade. She looked up at me, smiling, the sun catching the golden strands of her hair, and said, "Yes, please, Daddy." In that moment, everything felt normal, perfect, even. But even as I turned back toward the kitchen, I could feel Karen's stare burning into our backs, and deep down, I knew that peace was about to shatter in a way I could never take back. The laptop incident didn't come out of nowhere. It was the eruption of a storm that had been building for months, each drop of venom from Karen adding pressure until the dam finally broke. If I told you this woman hated us from the very beginning, it wouldn't be an exaggeration. From the first day we moved in, she made it clear that our family didn't fit her picture of what this neighborhood should be. At first, it was subtle, tight smiles, curt nods, eyes that flickered with disapproval whenever my daughter played outside. But slowly, her disdain transformed into open hostility, and soon her petty complaints turned into targeted harassment. She would show up at our door uninvited, clipboard in hand, rattling off violations that didn't even exist in the bylaws. One week, it was the color of our mailbox being too dull. The next, it was the flowers my daughter planted being unsanctioned flora. She even accused my daughter of vandalizing the community playground because chalk drawings were found near the swings. My daughter couldn't even climb those swings without assistance, but that didn't matter to Karen. Logic was irrelevant, what mattered was control, and my family was her chosen canvas for cruelty. The harassment wasn't limited to us. She rallied other HOA board members against us, painting us as problem neighbors. Suddenly, meeting notices were mysteriously missing from our mailbox, fines we never heard about appeared on our record, and whispers followed us whenever we walked down the street. Parents began pulling their children away when my daughter tried to join a group game. I'd catch fragments of conversations. Their trouble, the HOA is watching them closely, better not get involved. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was social exile engineered by a woman who thrived on isolation tactics. My daughter, though brave beyond her years, wasn't immune to the pain. I remember the day she came home from school, eyes red, clutching her backpack like a shield. "Daddy," she whispered, "why do they hate me? I didn't do anything." How do you explain to a child that sometimes cruelty isn't earned, it's inflicted? How do you explain that her laughter, her existence, her difference was enough to spark the wrath of a woman who couldn't stand seeing someone she couldn't control? I held her close that day, promising her that people like Karen were just noise and that love and truth would always win. But deep down, I knew noise can be deafening and lies repeated enough can start sounding like truth to those who are too weak to resist them. Karen's attacks escalated further when she realized intimidation wasn't silencing us. She began weaponizing the police, calling them for false reports. Once it was suspicious activity because my daughter was walking slowly down the block with her therapy braces. Another time it was a noise complaint because she was giggling while watching a cartoon on her tablet. Each time the officers came, they left shaking their heads, apologizing, clearly tired of being used as pawns in her vendetta. But for Karen, it didn't matter. She reveled in the disruption, in the way neighbors peeked through curtains, watching as squad cars parked in front of her home. Every visit, no matter how baseless, was another victory for her in the silent war she had declared. There were moments when I almost broke character when the federal agent in me, the man trained to dismantle threats with precision, rose up and demanded action. But I swallowed it down. My training had taught me patience, discipline, restraint. I told myself it was better to wait, better to let her hang herself with her own rope. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, that rope only tightened around my daughter's spirit. Her smile grew smaller, her steps slower, her trust in the world weaker. And I began to realize that waiting might be costing her more than it was protecting her. The worst part was how Karen enjoyed her cruelty in public. She made a spectacle of it, ensuring every humiliation was witnessed. At a community barbecue, she loudly reminded me in front of everyone that children with issues should stay home to avoid being disruptive. My daughter's face fell in front of dozens of families, her plate of food untouched as she quietly asked to go home. Another time, during a neighborhood cleanup, Karen snatched the trash bag out of my daughter's hands, sneering that she was just slowing everyone down. I saw the tears my daughter fought to hold back, saw the way she hid them behind lowered eyes, and in that moment, a part of me died, because nothing shreds a parent's soul like watching your child bleed invisible wounds. The whispers turned into full-blown rumors. Karen told neighbors my daughter was dangerous, that she had outbursts, that she couldn't be trusted unsupervised. Lies, all of them, but powerful enough to make some neighbors believe. Soon, children no longer came over for playdates, parents pulled their kids away when we walked by, and invitations stopped coming. My daughter was being erased from her own community, and Karen was holding the eraser. By the time the laptop incident happened, the ground had already been poisoned. Neighbors weren't shocked by Karen's aggression, they were conditioned to excuse it. To them, she was the authority, the enforcer, the voice of the HOA. And when authority dresses itself in righteousness, people follow blindly, even when that righteousness is nothing more than malice in disguise. But what Karen didn't understand was this: the very silence she mistook for weakness was a mask. Beneath it lived a man who had stared down terrorists, dismantled cartels, and outwitted criminals who believed themselves untouchable. She thought she was waging war against a powerless family. What she didn't know was that she was poking a sleeping lion, and every jab brought her closer to the day that lion would wake up. The day it happened is burned into my memory with a clarity so sharp it still cuts. The sky had been impossibly blue, the kind of blue that made you think nothing bad could ever happen beneath it. Children rode their bikes up and down the cul-de-sac, neighbors watered lawns, and my daughter sat on our porch, her laptop resting carefully on her knees as she worked on a story she had been writing for days. She was smiling to herself, lost in her words, humming a tune she had picked up from one of her therapy sessions. I stood at the kitchen window, watching her, letting the peace of that moment wash over me like a bomb. It felt fragile, fleeting, like a bubble that could burst with the slightest touch. And then Karen appeared. She stormed out of her house with the force of a hurricane, phone in one hand, HOA binder in the other, striding across the street as though the pavement itself belonged to her. Her voice came first, shrill, sharp, cutting through the calm like a siren. "You can't sit out here with that," she barked, pointing at my daughter's laptop as though it were a weapon. My daughter froze, startled, looking up at the woman who had tormented her for months. She stammered, "I'm just writing. I'm not hurting anyone." But Karen was already in full rage mode, the kind of rage that logic couldn't touch. I dropped the dish I was holding and rushed toward the door, but before I could reach her, Karen closed the distance. She ripped the laptop from my daughter's lap with a force that nearly toppled her. My daughter's cry of shock cut through the air, but it was drowned out by Karen's venom. "This is against HOA rules. You can't loiter like this, cluttering the neighborhood with your nonsense." The neighbors turned their heads. Some paused mid-step. Some even pulled out their phones. But no one moved to intervene. And then, in one horrifying, unthinkable moment, Karen raised the laptop high above her head and brought it crashing down onto my daughter's skull. The sound was sickening, a sharp crack of plastic and bone colliding, a noise that seemed to echo down the street. My daughter screamed, her hands flying to her head as she collapsed onto the porch, blood already seeping through her fingers. Time stopped, my lungs seized, the world blurred. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart and my daughter's wails of pain. I was at her side in seconds, my knees hitting the concrete as I pulled her into my arms, shielding her from further harm. Are you insane? I roared at Karen, my voice breaking with fury I had kept buried for far too long. But she didn't flinch. She stood there, chest heaving, face twisted with self-righteousness, as though she had just carried out some holy duty. This is what happens when you think the rules don't apply to you, she spat, eyes blazing. Maybe now you'll learn. Neighbors gasped. Some whispered. A few even shook their heads in disbelief. But still, no one stepped forward. They stood frozen, caught between horror and cowardice, unwilling to challenge the tyrant who had ruled over them for so long. And in that silence, I felt something inside me snap. I pressed my hand against my daughter's wound, whispering reassurances, even as my mind raced with tactical calculations. Her pulse was strong. The wound was bleeding, but not catastrophic. She needed medical care immediately. I called for an ambulance, my voice sharp, commanding, leaving no room for hesitation. The dispatcher's voice promised help was on the way, but every second stretched like an eternity as I cradled her trembling body. Karen, unbelievably, didn't stop. She began yelling at the gathering crowd, insisting that my daughter had provoked her, that she had been obstructing the common area, that the HOA rules justified her actions. Her words were madness, but the truly terrifying part was the way some neighbors averted their eyes, unwilling to contradict her, as though some small part of them believed she might actually be right. That silence was a second betrayal, and it cut as deep as the blow my daughter had just endured. When the sirens finally pierced the air, relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. The paramedics rushed to us, lifting my daughter gently onto a stretcher, their faces grim but professional. As they worked, a police cruiser pulled up, and for the briefest moment, I thought justice had arrived. But then Karen pounced, her voice shrill and commanding, weaving a web of lies before I could even open my mouth. She attacked me. Karen shrieked, clutching her arm dramatically. She tried to hit me with that laptop, and I defended myself. The audacity nearly stole my breath. My daughter, barely conscious, being wheeled into an ambulance with a head wound, and this woman had the gall to paint herself as the victim. One officer hesitated, glancing between Karen and me, uncertain, his training ill-equipped for the insanity of HOA politics turned violent. The other officer, thankfully, saw through it, his jaw tightening as he muttered something under his breath and began taking statements from witnesses. But here was the cruel truth. Many of those witnesses looked away. Some stammered. Some said they didn't see everything. Fear had infected them so deeply that even with a bleeding child before their eyes, they were reluctant to stand against Karen. I could feel rage clawing at my chest, a rage so potent it threatened to consume me. I wanted to unleash it right there, to rip the mask off and show Karen exactly who she was dealing with. But my daughter's fragile body on that stretcher held me back. She needed her father, not the federal agent lurking beneath the surface. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens wailed into the distance, I turned back to Karen. She smirked, actually smirked, like she had won some twisted battle. And in that moment, I knew something with absolute clarity. She believed she was untouchable. She believed the HOA shielded her, the neighbors feared her, and the system would overlook her. She believed she could break a child and walk away with nothing but another line in her rulebook. What she didn't believe, what she couldn't even fathom, was that the man she had just declared war against was someone who spent his life dismantling monsters exactly like her. And as I watched her preen before the officers, lying with the confidence of a seasoned manipulator, I made myself a promise. She was done. Karen had crossed a line she could never uncross, and she had no idea just how close she was to being crushed under the weight of a justice far greater than she could imagine. That night, as I sat in the sterile hospital room, watching my daughter sleep beneath a web of four lines and bandages, something inside me shifted. For years, I had built a life of silence, blending in with suburban normalcy, choosing to be just another face in the crowd. My work as a federal agent had always demanded secrecy, missions classified, victories unsung, battles fought in shadows. My neighbors saw me as a quiet man, a father who kept to himself, mowing his lawn on Saturdays and waving politely at the mailbox. They never knew that behind the calm exterior lived someone who had stared down enemies who would make Karen look like a playground bully. And maybe that was the point. I wanted peace for my daughter, a place where her battles were small enough to be conquered with courage and love, not by the barrel of a gun or the weight of federal law. But as I traced the outline of the bruise on her forehead, the anger boiled again. Karen had mistaken my restraint for weakness. She thought she could smash a laptop against a disabled child's head and walk away with a smirk because nobody in the neighborhood had the spine to stand against her. She didn't understand that while she played queen of her cul-de-sac kingdom, I had been trained to dismantle tyrants far more dangerous than her. She thought the worst I could do was complain to the HOA board or file a police report. She had no idea that my reach extended far beyond the picket fences and manicured lawns she ruled. I remembered faces from my past, men who trafficked children, cartels, who believed themselves untouchable white-collar criminals who bought judges and politicians like toys. I had watched them fall, one by one, when the weight of evidence and relentless pursuit caught up to them. Karen didn't know it, but she had just put herself in that same category. She had crossed from petty harassment into felony assault, and she was about to learn what it felt like when someone with both the skills and the authority decided enough was enough. In the days that followed, I moved carefully, deliberately. Outwardly, I was the grieving father, quiet and withdrawn, focused on my daughter's recovery. But behind closed doors, the agent in me woke up. I began documenting every single thing, every note Karen had left, every bogus fine, every witness who whispered their stories to me in confidence. I set up cameras around my property not just to protect my daughter, but to catch Karen in the act of her habitual stalking. And when neighbors complained privately about Karen's harassment of them, I listened, filing it all away, weaving their grievances into a tapestry of corruption and abuse that stretched far beyond a single act of violence. It didn't take long to uncover what I had suspected all along. Karen's reign was built on more than arrogance, it was built on fraud. As treasurer of the HOA, she had been skimming funds, issuing phony fines, and funneling money into accounts only she controlled. She used intimidation to silence questions and weaponized rules to target those who resisted. For years, she had been stealing not just peace, but hard-earned money from every family in the neighborhood. And now, with her assault on my daughter, I had the leverage to bring everything crashing down. Still, I waited. Patience is a weapon most people never master, but it had been forged into me through years of undercover work. Karen strutted around the neighborhood, still puffed up with false confidence, certain she had won. She didn't know that every step she took was being recorded, every word she spoke to neighbors was being tracked, every fraudulent dollar she moved was being traced. She thought she was safe behind the shield of community fear, but she had just stepped into the crosshairs of someone who thrived on patience and precision. Meanwhile, my daughter's resilience became my anchor. Even bandaged and bruised, she whispered, "Daddy, I'll be okay. Don't let her win." Her strength humbled me. She didn't know the storm I was quietly preparing, but she didn't need to. All she needed to know was that her father would never let this stand. When I finally moved, I moved with purpose. I reached out to colleagues in law enforcement not as a desperate parent, but as a fellow agent. I shared the evidence, not just of the assault, but of the years of fraud and intimidation. I filed reports that bypassed the local channels Karen believed she could manipulate, sending them directly to federal investigators who had no patience for HOA corruption. And I made sure Karen never saw it coming. To the neighbors, I was still the quiet man next door. But behind the curtain, I was pulling strings she couldn't see, setting traps she couldn't escape. I knew how people like her operated, full of arrogance, blind to consequences, convinced of their own invincibility. And I knew that arrogance was the very weakness I would exploit. The night before everything unraveled, I stood on my porch, watching Karen bark at a neighbor about their lawn height, waving her clipboard like a scepter. She didn't even notice me standing there in the shadows, didn't see the way my eyes followed her every move. She had no idea that by the next week, her empire would collapse around her. She didn't know that her lies were already in the hands of people who didn't care about HOA politics, only about justice. And as I turned back in my house, I allowed myself the smallest of smiles, not of joy, but of resolve. Because Karen thought she had broken us. She thought she had silenced my daughter with fear and humiliation. But what she had really done was awaken the side of me I had tried so hard to keep buried, the side that doesn't just protect, but destroys predators with precision. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she hadn't just picked a fight with a neighbor. She had picked a fight with a federal agent. And that fight was about to end in a way she could never have imagined. The first crack in Karen's empire came quietly, so quietly she didn't even notice it at first. It wasn't in the middle of a shouting match or a dramatic HOA meeting. It was a simple letter, neatly folded, delivered by certified mail. She opened it on her porch, eyebrows furrowing as her eyes skimmed the page. What she didn't know was that it wasn't just a letter. It was the first domino, pushed deliberately, that would topple everything she had built. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was officially investigating allegations of discrimination and abuse of authority within her HOA. She laughed it off at first, waving the paper at a neighbor, sneering that some idiot had filed a baseless complaint. But behind her laugh, I saw the flicker in her eyes, the first hint of doubt. Karen was arrogant, but not stupid. She knew how easily investigations like this could grow teeth. And they did. Within weeks, subpoenas began landing like thunderclaps. Bank records were requested. HOA meeting minutes were seized. Emails she thought she had deleted were pulled from servers. Every fine she had issued, every dollar she had pocketed, every falsified record she had signed, it all started surfacing. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak suddenly found courage when investigators knocked on their doors. One by one, they began telling their stories of bogus violations, of threats to tow cars, of late-night intimidation. Each testimony was another nail in her coffin. But I didn't stop there. My training had taught me that dismantling corruption isn't just about exposing lies, it's about cutting off every escape route. So, I worked my network, quietly ensuring the case reached people high enough that no local influence could bury it. Friends in the U.S. Attorney's Office, former colleagues in the FBI, contacts who specialized in financial crimes. Karen thought she was fighting a neighbor's complaint. What she was really facing was a federal dragnet closing around her with every passing day. The neighborhood began to change, too. At first, whispers spread, rumors that Karen might be in trouble. She dismissed them with her usual bravado, showing up at meetings, pounding her gavel, barking orders. But her authority began to crack when people started pushing back. A father whose son had been fined for riding a skateboard on the sidewalk stood up and demanded answers. A widow who had been charged thousands for landscape violations she never committed refused to pay. Even the timid families, the ones who had always avoided eye contact, began questioning why their fees were so high and their voices so small. The fear Karen had cultivated for years was evaporating, replaced by something stronger, anger. And anger, once awakened, doesn't go back to sleep. I remember one meeting in particular when Karen tried to silence a mother who accused her of harassment. Order! Karen shrieked, slamming her gavel. But the room didn't fall silent the way it used to. Instead, voices rose, dozens of them, demanding accountability. She shouted louder, but the sound was drowned out. For the first time, she wasn't in control. I stood at the back of the room, silent, watching her unravel, knowing the real storm was still on its way. The financial investigation hit hardest. For years, Karen had siphoned funds through shell accounts, convinced no one would ever scrutinize the HOA's books. But When federal auditors began laying out the discrepancies, line by line, dollar by dollar, her mask of confidence began to slip. Suddenly, her house of cards wasn't just shaking, it was collapsing. She scrambled, calling emergency board meetings, sending desperate emails, trying to rally her shrinking circle of loyalists. But loyalty built on fear doesn't last long under fire. One by one, they began abandoning her, some even turning evidence over to save themselves. The day the FBI showed up, unmarked cars rolling quietly into the neighborhood, was the day everything changed. Karen stood on her lawn, shouting about her rights, waving her arms as agents carried out boxes of files from the HOA office. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, some cheering openly, others whispering in shock. My daughter, standing beside me with a bandage still covering her healing wound, gripped my hand tightly. For the first time in months, her eyes held a glimmer of triumph. She saw the monster who had terrorized her finally being dragged into the light. But justice isn't just about public takedowns, it's about consequences that last. Karen was indicted not only for the assault on my daughter, but also for fraud, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. The charges stacked like bricks, heavy and undeniable. Her smirk, once plastered on her face like armor, was gone. In its place was the hollow stare of someone who finally realized the game was over. For me. Though the greatest satisfaction wasn't in watching her led away in handcuffs, it was in seeing the neighborhood transform. The people who had once been silent began speaking freely again. Children played without fear of being fined. Families planted gardens without worrying about citations. For the first time since moving there, I saw laughter replace whispers, and though many still didn't know the full extent of my role in Karen's downfall, I didn't need them to. My daughter knew. She knew her father had kept his promise. She knew that Karen hadn't won. Still, I didn't forget. My work had taught me that monsters rarely disappear completely. They resurface, reinvent, try to claw their way back. And that's why I made sure the evidence against Karen was airtight, impossible to dismiss, impossible to appeal. I wanted her downfall to be permanent, a warning to anyone who thought cruelty and corruption could reign unchecked. Justice had struck back, not with fists or violence, but with something far more powerful, truth, evidence, and the weight of a system designed to protect the innocent when it's wielded by someone who knows how to use it. Karen had underestimated me, underestimated us. She thought we were just another family she could crush beneath her rules. Instead, she became the example, the cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused and a community finally says enough. And as I tucked my daughter into bed that night, her head resting safely on her pillow, she whispered, "Daddy, is it over?" I kissed her forehead and whispered back, "Yes, sweetheart, it's over. She can't hurt us anymore." But inside, I knew it wasn't just over, it was transformed. Because this wasn't just about one family's fight. It was about reclaiming an entire community from the grip of a tyrant. And in that victory, my daughter had not only survived, she had won. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, every corner filled with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers who had followed the scandal from the beginning. The air buzzed with anticipation, the kind that comes when justice feels close enough to touch. At the center of it all sat Karen, no longer the imperious figure who once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. She looked smaller now, her hair unkempt, her once sharp wardrobe replaced with the dull suit of a defendant. But even there, with the weight of federal charges hanging over her, she couldn't resist glaring at me and my family as if we were the ones on trial. The prosecutor's opening was sharp, clinical, and devastating. Every word cut through Karen's defenses like a blade. "This is not the story of a woman enforcing community rules," the attorney declared. "This is the story of a woman who weaponized power, inflicted pain, and committed crimes against the very people she was entrusted to serve." He outlined the charges: embezzlement, fraud, abuse of authority, and the most shocking of all, aggravated assault on a disabled child. Each word echoed through the chamber like a hammer striking steel. Karen's defense tried to paint her as misunderstood, a woman who had been overwhelmed with responsibility, who had lost her temper in a moment of stress. But that argument crumbled quickly when evidence was presented. Surveillance footage showed her storming across the lawn toward my daughter. Medical records detailed the concussion and trauma inflicted by the smashed laptop. Financial documents revealed years of skimming HOA funds, accounts she couldn't explain. Her emails, projected on a massive screen, revealed language dripping with disdain and prejudice toward her neighbors. Each piece of evidence wasn't just a strike against her, it was a tidal wave she couldn't outrun. And then came the testimonies. Neighbors lined up one after another, voices trembling but strong, recounting years of intimidation. A mother spoke about the night Karen threatened to tow her car because her child left a toy in the driveway. A retired veteran told the court about fines he'd received for having a flagpole in his yard. One by one, the stories piled up, painting a portrait of a tyrant who had bullied an entire community. When it was my turn to take the stand, the room fell silent. I looked at Karen, her eyes still locked on me with defiance, and then at the jury, who waited, pens poised, eyes sharp. I spoke not as a federal agent, but as a father. I described my daughter's resilience, her struggles, her small triumphs that meant the world to us. I told them how she sat that day with her laptop, just wanting to feel normal, and how, in a single violent act, Karen had stolen that peace from her. My voice broke when I recalled the sight of my little girl bleeding in my arms, her cries echoing in my ears. The jury leaned in, their faces etched with sympathy, anger, and disbelief. For once, I let them see the man behind the badge, the father behind the fight. The defense tried to shake me, questioning my background, hinting that I had used my connections to fuel the case. But their words fell flat when the prosecutor reminded the jury that none of my credentials could fabricate the mountain of evidence against Karen. By the time I stepped down from the stand, I could feel the momentum. The tide had turned fully against her. The climax came during closing arguments. The prosecutor's voice thundered through the courtroom. This defendant believed she was untouchable. She believed that fear could silence truth, that cruelty could replace justice. But today, you, the jury, hold the power to say enough. He pointed toward Karen, who sat stiffly, her face pale, her hands trembling despite her efforts to appear composed. Will you allow this abuse to go unanswered, or will you show that in this country no one is above the law? When the jury filed out to deliberate, the room buzzed with whispers. My daughter squeezed my hand tightly, her eyes wide with both fear and hope. Hours passed like days, every tick of the clock echoing in my chest. And then, finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, paper in hand, voice steady as he read the verdicts one by one. Guilty on embezzlement, guilty on fraud, guilty on civil rights violations, guilty on aggravated assault. Each word was like a stone dropped in still water, rippling through the room until it erupted in gasps, whispers, and quiet tears of relief. Karen's face crumbled as the final guilty rang out. For the first time, the woman who had once carried herself with unshakable arrogance looked utterly powerless. The judge, stern and unwavering, addressed her with words that would echo for years. You abused trust, inflicted harm, and undermined the very community you were meant to serve. This court will not tolerate such acts. With that, he sentenced her to years in prison alongside restitution that would strip away the fortune she had stolen. The gavel struck. Justice, real and undeniable, had been delivered. As we walked out of that courtroom, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, neighbors clapped us on the back. But for me, the true victory was quieter, my daughter's smile. For the first time in months, it wasn't shadowed by fear. She looked up at me and whispered, "We won, Daddy." And in that moment, I knew she was right, not just because Karen was gone, but because we had shown that even the cruelest abuse of power could be broken when truth and courage stood against it. When the dust finally settled and Karen was taken away in handcuffs, a strange quiet fell over the neighborhood. For years, her voice had been the loudest, her shadow the longest, her grip the strongest. Now, There was only silence where her orders and threats used to be. But this wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of relief. Neighbors who once kept their blinds shut began waving again. Children who had been scolded for riding bikes now filled the streets with laughter. Gardens bloomed where Karen once issued fines. The community, broken for so long, began to heal. And in that healing, I saw something more powerful than any verdict. I saw people reclaim their lives. For my family, the journey didn't end in the courtroom. My daughter still bore the scar from that day, a reminder etched into her skin of cruelty we'll never forget. But she also carried something else, a spark of courage she didn't know she had. She told me one night, "Daddy, she wanted to hurt me, but now everyone knows the truth. She didn't win." In her eyes, I saw resilience that no blow, no wound could ever erase. She had faced hate and still chosen hope. That, more than anything, became our victory. As for me, I didn't see myself as the hero of this story. I was simply a father who refused to let his child's suffering go unanswered. Yes, my training, my career, my connections helped bring justice, but the real power came from something much simpler: love. Love for my daughter, love for what's right, love for a community worth saving. That love fueled every step, every decision, every sleepless night. And in the end, it was love that beat fear, truth that beat lies, and unity that beat tyranny. Looking back, I realized Karen's downfall wasn't just about her crimes, it was about the lesson her story now carries. Power abused will always collapse. Lies may spread for a time, but truth always finds its way to the surface. And no matter how alone you feel in the fight, there are always people, sometimes strangers, sometimes neighbors, waiting for someone to take the first stand so they can join in. To everyone hearing this story now, whether you've faced your own HOA Karen or someone who thought they could bully you into silence, remember this: silence only fuels the tyrant. But courage, even the smallest spark of it, can set a whole fire of change. Never underestimate what standing up, calmly, firmly, and with proof on your side can do. And to my daughter, if she ever watches this again years from now, you are my hero. Your strength reminded me what true bravery looks like. You taught me that even when the world feels unfair, we don't have to bow to it, we can fight it and we can win. This is where our story ends, but it's also where yours might begin. Because what happened here isn't just entertainment or gossip, it's a reminder. A reminder that justice is possible. A reminder that families, no matter how small, can take on giants. And a reminder that no one is above the law. So, if this story moved you, if it made you feel that fire inside, don't let it stop here. Share it, talk about it, and most of all, join us. Subscribe to this channel. Be part of this growing community where we shine a light on truth, on resilience, and on the strength of families who refuse to be broken. Every story we tell here is a voice against silence, and every subscription is a promise that these voices will keep getting louder. Because together, we don't just watch stories. Together, we change them. If this story shook you, imagine how many more voices deserve to be heard. Don't let stories like this fade. Subscribe now and be part of a community that refuses to stay silent.